Hello everyone, and welcome to the very first episode of a series of video essays called Excessively Moderate. For this episode, we'll be taking a moderate look at the Brexit and breaking through the hyperbole and exaggeration that you've most likely been hearing since the people of UK first voted to leave the EU. So grab your iced tea, sit back, and enjoy. Now that the Brexit is being talked about everywhere, you've probably heard different opinions ranging from, "We're all doomed, the European Union will fall, financial disaster," and so on, as well as to, "Freedom for Britain, Britain has its autonomy back, we'll take back control of our borders," and the like. However, as usual, the truth falls somewhere in the middle of these two extremes. Let's start at the beginning. Now you've probably all heard of the Brexit. This relates to a referendum held by the United Kingdom to ask its citizens whether or not they would prefer to remain in the EU or leave. A massive series of advertising campaigns both for and against the Brexit began, and thus began an incredible series of misinformation, confusion, and propaganda that usually accompany most major votes. The problem is, after the votes were counted, no one was really quite sure what it was they had voted for, nor what the impact would be. Now, this isn't really the fault of the people who voted. Not only was there an incredible amount of quote-unquote facts being thrown about, but also, it's not quite clear what they were voting for. But wait, I hear you say, wasn't the referendum clear in terms of the options? Well, yes, very much so. As a marketing academic myself, I can say that the way the question was posed, unlike the referendum in, say, Crimea, was very clear from a sort of methodology standpoint. The problem was the fact that the referendum is not legally binding, and this is the key point that needs to be made. Since it isn't legally binding, no one has any idea what the referendum means. Anyone who claims to know exactly what will happen either doesn't understand, or is lying. Or, well, is part of the Illuminati, lizard people, or whoever's controlling the world these days. Anyway. While there have been some excellent economic analyses on what the results would be of, say, a full withdrawal from the EU, there is absolutely no guarantee that that will actually happen. So here on Excessively Moderate, we'll be trying to see what are the different possibilities or scenarios that will happen now that the people of the UK have voted, starting with the least likely scenario and moving on to the most likely scenario. Scenario number 1. Nothing happens. Now, this is not the least likely scenario. It's the least likely of the most possible scenarios, if that makes any sense. The thing is, it's actually semi-possible that nothing will happen as a result of the Brexit. Allow me to explain. You see, when it comes to economics, there's one element that economists prefer above all else. That, with everything else being equal, stability is the most preferred asset of all. Change is usually fought tooth and nail by most, and the status quo is king. This is because various interests benefit from the fact that they understand the current system, have made profitable ventures using the current system, and any changes threaten this situation. Even as these changes have the possibility of making things better, it's still better to keep things as they are. Well-known, understandable, predictable. As such, when the British Parliament comes to vote on whether or not it wants to leave the EU, it will definitely have the results of the referendum in the back of their mind, with an incredibly high voter turnout rate of 72% voting to leave. But at the same time, there will be another powerful force pushing against this. The various business interests, banks, financial institutions, import-export companies, companies with strong ties to the EU, etc., etc., etc. All of them pushing to minimize any kind of change to the status quo which may hurt their interests. I don't believe in all the conspiracy theories talking about how a group of banks and rich people control the whole world. But at the same time, you cannot extricate the highly influential role money plays in politics and in shaping the course of certain policies. Now, this all may result in a very interesting situation. Either the British Parliament might actually vote against leaving the EU against the will of the majority, or perhaps another referendum might be held. But this time, after the massive shock that happened to the British pound and the stock exchange, fresh in the people's minds, and a greater awareness about the impact of the people's votes. As mentioned before, this scenario is possible, but the least likely of the three scenarios we will discuss today. Scenario number 2. Britain leaves the EU. I know this seems odd to put as only the second most likely scenario, but at the same time, this isn't as much of a foregone conclusion as people like to think. I'll discuss why in the next scenario. However, when it comes to Britain actually leaving the EU, it probably will not be either as disastrous as some people say, nor as amazing as others claim. Once again, the truth is somewhere in the middle. Let's look at it this way. One of the key arguments for Britain to leave the EU is that it will reduce the regulatory burden. But is that true? Of course, to an extent, yes, but at the same time, you'll find that many businesses actually like these regulations. Now, before I lose you here, as this idea flies in the face of all conventional wisdom of the free market, consider this. Would you rather have to deal with one set of regulations, like the EU, or would you prefer your products to go through 2 or more sets of regulations? UK regulations and the EU regulations. You see, companies like the fact that if they get through the regulatory requirements of one EU member state, they've pretty much passed them all. The UK might end up with fewer regulations than the EU, but just the fact that the regulations are different more than eliminates any advantage gained. So what will happen then? Probably the UK, at least in the beginning, will continue using almost the exact same rules and regulations as the EU. Remember, the status quo is king. Companies don't like regulations, but they like change even less. So the UK might actually leave the EU, but function almost exactly the same as it did when it was a member. This same concept applies to London being the financial center of Europe. Do you really think that all of that is going to change overnight because of some changes in regulations? Don't forget, Britain hasn't even adopted the euro nor the Schengen area. In other words, the changes to the UK's situation, even if it leaves the EU, will not really amount to much. Officially, it will be out. Unofficially, the same financial, economic, production, and other ties it had with Europe will remain exactly as it is. Differences will only become apparent after decades of separation, not years. Scenario 3. Britain stays, but changes its agreement with the EU. Say what you will about the Brexit, but the main driving force for it seems to be the issue of immigration from less wealthy European countries to Britain. This was probably the most poignant idea in people's minds when they headed for the polls. So what happens when, after long rounds of discussions, the UK agrees with the EU that they stay as a member, but reduce the flow of immigrants in and out of the country? This scenario, in my opinion, is the most likely of the three because, the thing is, businesses and financial institutions in the UK want to remain to preserve the cohesion in regulations, increased access to a unified market, and to hold on to the stability that is the European Union. People in the UK, on the other hand, want to keep immigrants outside. There is an obvious happy middle ground somewhere to be found without making people think or feel that their government has betrayed them. In my opinion, considering the level of regret that many British people have been feeling, and even the jittery nature of opposition parties after winning in the referendum, the UK is neither ready nor willing to make drastic changes to its economy. What is more likely to happen is that there will be changes on the social level, but not on the economic level. Britain renegotiates its role in the EU, and everyone is happy. Well, except for the immigrants, but that's another issue for another day. In conclusion, the Brexit was and is a major deal, and it marks a shift in the way people think about the EU and its role in the world. However, it's the psychological impact that will be its greatest legacy. On the actual policy and economic front, not much in terms of changes are likely to be seen. After the initial drop in the British pound and in the London Stock Exchange, everything is leveled off. The quote-unquote crisis has passed and the world keeps on turning. Very, very few people will feel any kind of change as a result of this vote. Once again, with exception to immigrants in Europe. Don't give in to the hype and hyperbole. The vote does not spell the end of the UK's involvement in the EU, much less the end of the European Union itself. In the end, like most other great events, it means something big, just not what people expect it to mean. I hope you all enjoyed the video. If you did, click the like button. If you want to subscribe, click on the button below. And if you want to see more videos like this, then refill your iced tea and choose a video from the side. Thanks for watching.